She moved into the neighborhood quietly, just another woman making a home. But soon, whispers turned to stares, and stares into open hostility. The neighbors claimed she didn't belong, that she wasn't one of them. They wanted her gone. What they didn't know was that the woman they were trying to push out wasn't powerless. She carried a truth so explosive it would shake their world. Because in the courtroom, their future rested in her hands. And when the truth came out, it wasn't just shocking. It was justice in its purest form. It had been a fresh start for her. After years of long hours and late nights, she had finally reached a point where she could afford a home of her own. A quiet, tree-lined street where families waved from porches and children played in the yard. She imagined peace here, a place where she could rest after the weight of the courtroom. But from the very first week, she felt it. The sideways glances, the hushed conversations that ended abruptly when she passed. At first, she brushed it off as the uneasiness of being new. She kept her head high, tending to her garden, greeting the neighbors with a smile that often went unanswered. Then came the first note slipped under her door, anonymous, cruel, and sharp. "You don't belong here." A week later, the whispers became louder, morphing into complaints at the neighborhood association. Her car was mysteriously scratched, trash left on her lawn. Each small act carried the same message: leave. They didn't see her as a neighbor. They saw her as an outsider. But what none of them realized was that she had faced hostility before, inside courtrooms, in boardrooms, even in her own profession. This was not new. What was new, however, was the cruel irony. The very people trying to drive her away would soon find themselves standing before her bench. And in that moment, she would hold their fate in her hands. The hostility didn't fade, it multiplied. What began with stares and muttered words soon became a campaign to drive her out. The neighbors called meetings where her name was spoken like a stain on the neighborhood. They accused her of lowering the property value, of not fitting in. Some even claimed she was dangerous.
If you believe in justice, hit like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story that matters.
Though none could explain why. One evening, she returned home to find a petition taped to her door, more than a dozen signatures scrawled beneath the words, "We, the undersigned, demand her removal from this community." The message was clear. They wanted her gone, and they weren't going to stop until she left. She held the paper in her hand, feeling the weight of it. Each name belonged to a person who had smiled to her face, then turned around and sharpened their knives in secret. It wasn't just rejection anymore, it was hatred, deliberate and organized. And it stung in a way that was far too familiar. Nights became restless. She would hear footsteps near her window, whispers in the dark. One morning, she discovered her tires slashed. Another day, she woke to find crude words spray-painted on her fence. Each act chipped away at the peace she had dreamed of when she moved in. But even through the fear, she refused to bend. She cleaned the graffiti, replaced the tires, and walked into her home with her head held high. On the surface, she seemed unshaken, but inside, she knew the storm was building. Then came the breaking point. The neighbors filed an official complaint with the housing association, accusing her of violating rules she hadn't broken. Their goal was simple: eviction. They claimed she disturbed the peace, that her presence alone made the neighborhood uncomfortable. It was a polished version of the same old prejudice, wrapped in legal jargon, but rotten at its core. And so, a date was set, a hearing, where the neighbors would gather to testify against her. They believed it was only a matter of time before she was forced out. What they didn't know was that this fight would not play out in the way they imagined. Because beyond the street, beyond the gossip, she held a title that none of them had cared to know. She wasn't just a woman living quietly next door. She was a judge. And not just any judge, but the very one assigned to preside over a looming case involving the same neighbors now trying to destroy her life. They thought they had cornered her. In reality, they had walked blindly into a courtroom where their whispers and signatures would be weighed against the truth. And in that space, there would be no hiding from who she truly was. The day of the hearing arrived. The neighbors came dressed in their finest, their voices rehearsed, their confidence radiating as they whispered among themselves. To them, this was the final blow, the moment they would finally rid their community of the woman they despised. They filed into the courtroom, smirking as they spotted her seated quietly in the back. A few even exchanged mocking glances, certain they were about to watch her humiliation unfold in public. But then the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise for the honorable judge." And when she stepped forward, robes flowing, head held high, the room froze. The same neighbors who had signed their names to drive her away now stood face to face with the reality they had never imagined. The woman they tried to erase was the one holding the gavel. The silence was heavy, suffocating. She took her seat at the bench, her expression calm but firm. The papers, the petitions, the accusations, all now evidence before her. Each neighbor shifted uncomfortably, their bravado dissolving into shock and fear. They had thought of her as powerless, as voiceless. But in this room, she was the authority. The testimonies began, but their words faltered under the weight of her gaze. Every fabricated complaint sounded hollow, every accusation unraveling under the truth. What had seemed like strength in their neighborhood meetings now looked like desperation in a courtroom. And then she spoke, not as the target of their hatred, but as the judge tasked with upholding justice. Her words were measured, deliberate, and unshakable. "This court," she said, "does not bend to prejudice. It bends only to truth." In that instant, the power dynamic shifted completely. They were no longer the aggressors. They were defendants in a moral trial far greater than the case at hand. The neighbors who once believed they could erase her now stood powerless before her authority, exposed for what they truly were. For them, it was the moment everything unraveled. For her, it was the moment everything became clear. When the gavel struck, the case was closed. Not just legally, but morally. The neighbors who once conspired against her left the courtroom in silence, their arrogance stripped away. They had set out to erase her, only to be judged by the very woman they had tried to destroy. For her, it was never about revenge. It was about dignity, about standing firm in the face of prejudice. She returned to her home that evening the same way she always had, quietly, without fanfare. But this time, the neighborhood was different. The whispers had died. The stares had vanished. And the power they once thought they held over her was gone forever. She had been forced to fight for her place in a neighborhood she had every right to call home. And in doing so, she revealed something far greater. That justice is not just a concept for the courtroom. It is a demand for fairness in every street, every home, every community.